My name is Victoria Fareld, and I'm an intellectual historian at Stockholm University. And I am happy to introduce our next speaker this afternoon, Gérard Raulet, from Sorbonne University in Paris. He is specialized in German philosophy and intellectual history, and has worked extensively on Walter Benjamin, Karl Marx, the tradition of critical theory, and German intellectual culture broadly conceived. He is also a translator from German into French, translator of Herbert Marcuse, Ernst Bloch und Jürgen Habermas. And he has, since the 1970s, published widely in French, German, and English. And among some of his recent publications, we find a book about German philosophy after 1945, La philosophie allemande depuis 1945. He's written a book about political philosophy today in German, Republikanische Legitimität und politische Philosophie. He's also written a book in English, Critical Cosmology, on Nations and Globalization, an effort to critically think the phenomenon of globalization. And he's also co-edited a book on the Frankfurt School, in French, Les normes et le possible, héritage et perspective de l'école de Francfort. But today he will give a talk titled Mimesis, Priority of the Object and Reification. So please join me in welcoming Gérard Raulet.
Well, thank you for the presentation. I hope you hear me. I would like to thank the organizers of this conference, especially Herrn Sölter. And allow me, please, a preliminary remark. My English is not really fluent. I can write very slowly, but it might happen that I need help for the discussion. So please, I'd like to apologize. What I will present today is more or less a digest of my research orientations in the last months or years in order to reaffirm dimensions which are dying out in the last, or rather last but one, generation of the Frankfurt School. Let us begin with the early Adorno. From his early contacts with phenomenology, in the first phase of his philosophy, Adorno kept the idea of a necessity to return to things. In his later works, this injunction meets the question of reification. As a matter of fact, being under the object's mastery, Verfallenheit ans Objekt, is by no means a theoretical posture, nor is it a decision. It is actually the consequence of reification. As with philosophy, which in the context of a tendency towards total administration must acknowledge the importance of the system, the subject, which is supposed to be constitutive, must accept the primacy of the object in order to oppose the general tendency towards reification. Only thus can what can no more be thought become thinkable again. If identity is determined by reification, the object is nothing else than what the subject is not able to reflect anymore. The second reflection presupposes a recognition of the object's primacy. Or, to put it in Adorno's words, only the repeated experience of non-freedom, which brings the primacy of the object to its consciousness, can put the subject back on its own tracks. Adorno uses the same structure again in his aesthetic theory, in stronger words, but with comparable meaning. I quote him, "Only as things can artworks become the antithesis of reified non-being." End of quote. Adorno, when doing this, uses one of the fundamental patterns of Benjamin's thought. At the same time, his concern is to avoid what is uncontrollable about it, as well in terms of its references, as of its political strategy. My presentation today has no other ambition than to acknowledge this critical depth of Adorno towards Benjamin, but also to assess in how far Adorno's adaptation of Benjamin's intellectual impulses might have neglected some of its essential aspects, whose absence become painfully obvious in post-Adornian critical theory. Negative dialectics constitutes a critical assessment of the judgment of identity, which claims the formal reduction of particularity and individuality to be a free act of the subject, whilst it is rather its logical submission to the law of exchange. In order to do justice to the particular, it seems one should simply oppose to the idea of all things being interchangeable the pattern of the mimetic relationship. But things are far from being that simple. How far should reason's self-criticism go to become, in Adorno's words, nature made intelligible through its own alienation? How far does trying to compensate the demands of dominating rationality require us to play the object's game? Can mimetic power, in its philo and ontogenetic rooting, be the way to overcome the reification that comes as a result of the very logic which was right from the start, embedded in the concept itself, without needing to resort to the capitalist mode of relationship at work in knowledge? I will try to answer these questions, and this will lead me, in the last part of my presentation, to play Benjamin and Adorno against Honneth's conception of reification. First point, Adorno suggests in one of his first essays, The Idea of Natural History, published in 1932, that we should follow the path of post-Husserlian phenomenology, more specifically that of Max Scheler, who strived to overcome the subjectivist standpoint of philosophy, and that we should confront once again the ontological problem that Kant, in his Critique of Pure Reason, had put aside under the label of the thing in itself. Adorno's idea here can be traced back to what Benjamin had written as early as 1917 in his program of the coming philosophy, where he challenged the dualism of subject and object, hoping, I quote him, to uncover the original and authentic sphere of knowledge. This sphere, outside and beyond human subjectivity, where the foundation of all knowledge would lie, is still at the time, 1917, the divine language Benjamin mentioned in his essay on language, published 1 year earlier, 1916. But we must keep in mind that in the text of that period, the word divine does not refer to anything strictly religious, but to a metaphysical dimension beyond the dualism of subject and object that structures our concept of knowledge. According to Benjamin, the problem with Kant's critique of knowledge is that it is not emancipated from that dualism of subject and object, and that, as a result, transcendentalism ends up confirming a conception of reality in the terms of physical science. Against the latter conception, Benjamin puts forward the crossing of limits experienced in some pathological states, or in the mimetic behavior of primitive populations. I skipped the quotes, although they are quite important, but we have not enough time. This idea, anyway, agrees with that of a magic of language, which can be found in the essay of language in 1916. This magic lies in the fact that through the name, a secret pact is sealed between words and things, a pact which excludes the subject. In 1933, Benjamin writes explicitly in reference to that essay 2 sketches on the theory of resemblance and mimetic power. The idea of mimetic power aims at granting an epistemological status to what, back in 1916, was mere metaphysical speculations. The concept of mimesis insists that we must give precedence to the materiality of the encounter before projecting on this encounter the categories of subjectivity. To experience the world, I quote, in immediate contact with the materiality of things, this is the foundation of Benjamin's historic materialism, and this is also the argument of Adorno's text, The Actuality of Philosophy, in 1931. The program of all truly materialistic knowledge, Adorno writes, consists in keeping in check any assumption of a hypostatic meaning of objects, especially religious. The real source of the so-called problem of the thing in itself is actually, I quote again, the historical figures of commodity and trade value, not something which would lie behind reality. Although there is no explicit reference there to Benjamin, to whom Adorno was very close in his first essays, this page of The Actuality of Philosophy can definitely warn us against possible metaphysical misreadings, especially of the essay on language. For the name in Benjamin's essay is the medium of this kind of experience. It is in fact anything but an arbitrary sign. It does not belong to the category of signification, but coincides absolutely with what it designates. The child who mimics a mill or a train is the mill or the train. Mimetic power is indeed neither representation nor is it recreation. It is a presentation or even an identification. Fixated in the name, this identification constitutes a form of nominalism we can recognize as a modality of materialism. It can be found under this form in Marx's The Holy Family and in the preliminary reflections to the dialectics of enlightenment. Despite doubt and criticism, Adorno partially includes this idea of mimetic strategy in his own thought. In fact, in the process of reification, where the 2 poles of subject and object merge, one pole actually takes over the other. The subject thinks it is imposing its law to nature, whilst what really happens is that it suppresses itself. To counter this dialectic, Adorno formulates 2 apparently contradictory demands: the primacy of the object and the injunction, I quote him, to break with the lie of a constitutive subjectivity by using the power of the subject, end of quote. The way Adorno appropriates the concept of mimesis is illustrated by the review he publishes in 1938 on Roger Caillois's essay, The Praying Mantis. According to Adorno's interpretation, Caillois's thesis has a progressive aspect, insofar as it refuses to explain all psychological behaviors exclusively by the autonomous individual. Caillois's positive re-evaluation of nature, as opposed to culture and society, is in Adorno's eyes, interesting from the materialistic point of view that, I quote Adorno again, that could still be dragged out of Caillois's mythical perspective. Adorno even pays careful attention to the psychophysical conception, attaching psychological tendencies not to the autonomous individual's conscious life, but to an accumulation of somatic moments, which he believes is the positive consequence of the materialistic approach. The conclusion of this book review of 1938 is crucial. It suggests that there is a form of kinship between Caillois's conception of mimesis and what Adorno later calls mimesis of what is dead, mimesis ans Tote. Incidentally, the expression itself is more than likely to have been taken from Benjamin, its first use being, I believe, the following. I quote Benjamin: Victor Hugo, ignores the power of petrifying things, which, if a biological concept is suitable, manifests itself as a sort of mimesis of death in Baudelaire's poetry. End of quote. The mimesis of what is dead, mimesis of death, presents itself as the materialistic withdrawal of a philosophy that has lost all hope of thinking outside of reification. The same thing occurs with the name, as in Benjamin's theory. In Adorno's and Horkheimer's dialectic of enlightenment, the proper noun prevents any judgment of identity that would operate through a copula, in the same way that mimesis deters any temptation of equating non-equivalent things. The preparatory discussions which led to the dialectic of enlightenment provide long developments on that question. Both Adorno and Benjamin play immediacy against mediation and support the idea of a primacy of the object, which will be asserted in negative dialectics. The point is to thwart the logic of exchange. Without giving in to a naive form of realism, Adorno and Horkheimer recognize more or less implicitly in their discussions that nature has a substantial existence, wherefrom it ensues that its oppression is indeed a catastrophe. In other words, the repetition of a blind violence that is the consequence of the rational project of a total domination of nature. You know the famous citation, uncontrolled mimesis has been banished. And yet it is precisely by repressing the mimesis, by systematically subduing it to the judgment of identity, to the translation through reflection, as well as to the operation of the copula, that rationality transforms itself into a mimesis of what is dead, and that it produces behaviors that both Adorno and Horkheimer, the latter in his theory of the criminal, identify as a result of a death drive with references to Freud and Caillois. In the end, Adorno agrees with Caillois not only on the diagnosis, but also on the strategy, in fact the only possible one, except that Adorno endeavors to answer the French intellectual establishment's unfulfilled promises. When Kojève speaks of the end of history, and while in Bataille's thought animality and the homogeneous society both express the fact that political practice has proven incapable of changing the world, by the end of the 30s already, the authors of the dialectic of enlightenment use the recurring theme of animality as the central theme of a dialectical anthropology. And already in the late 30s, Adorno is preparing conceptual weapons for a resistance to homogeneous society from the very heart of homogeneity itself. Adorno's doubts concerning the mimetic strategy were justified only from a political point of view. Caillois himself did not actually trust the strategy to count on mimetism in order to fight fascism. But Adorno felt the need to reassert more strongly than ever the doubts already expressed while reading Benjamin's One Way Street about the risk of abandoning oneself to the object until the I is literally extinct. On a philosophical level now, the opposition between Benjamin and Adorno stems only from two radically different ontological conceptions. For Benjamin, the experience of reification is also a form of revelation of the world's essence, both human and cosmic, since precisely the human world goes beyond its own limits to eventually suppress itself into the cosmic world. For Adorno, on the contrary, the experience of reification is a historical experience and will remain so. The core of their disagreement is nothing other than the ground for the relationship between subject and object. And this is where the crucial problem lies. Benjamin and Adorno offer two different answers to the same question, to the question of transcendental affinity. Adorno stays true to the main argument of the critical theory of 1937, the mystery of transcendental affinity cannot be explained unless we take account the specific act of its completion at one precise point in history. Simply put, this relationship is different for the animistic man of primitive times and for us today in a technological or even immaterial time. In such a perspective, the question is to know whether or not the mimetic moment at work in the elective affinity between the knowing subject and the known object is authentic. In other words, whether reification is only an accident in the subject's relationship to the world of things, a historical aberration of which capitalism could without a doubt be held accountable, or if we must question the epistemological model asserting that the object is always the one who sets the tone. Also, critical theory has been profoundly revised in the dialectic of enlightenment under the influence of Benjamin's work. These two positions have never been clearly articulated and distinguished in recent critical theory. It is at this precise point that the question of the body steps in, that is the question of the subject's materiality. When Adorno accuses Benjamin of insufficient dialectical mediation, he has the immediacy of bodily and psychic presence in mind. He is perfectly right, since Benjamin tends indeed to displace the enigma of transcendental affinity towards the psychophysical order of the own body, the Leib. Along with the paradigm of language, the own body is recognized in Benjamin's conception as a source of that superior, most authentic way of knowing which was at stake in Benjamin's first text on the theory of knowledge. Thus, Benjamin's materialism is not limited to the name, which is always a proper noun, as I said. It is also located in the own body, and it is based upon the knowledge, I quote Benjamin, the knowledge that the first material on which the mimetic power is at work is the human body itself. It is therefore not reason to say It is therefore not reason to say nothing of understanding, but it is the own body that is actually the mimesis. Next step, contemporary representatives of critical theory, on the contrary, have chosen to move away from these fundamental philosophical dimensions of the early critical theory of the 30s and also the 40s when we think about the dialectic of enlightenment. Raulet, for example, in his cartography of critical theory, describes these conceptions as marginal and even as fruitless. He follows mainly Anglo-Saxon authors, especially Mead, who ignore this kind of speculation. When Mead and others read one of the fathers of French sociology, Gabriel Tarde, whose theory acknowledges the very phenomenon Benjamin wrote about, using the same name of mimetic power, they simply exclude his theory of suggestion. Even though this theory constitutes the center of Tarde's sociology, for me it is obvious, I quote him, that social conscience is the presupposition of imitation rather than the opposite. Mead embodies a sociological school of thought that refuses, as a matter of principle, any confrontation with the fundamental questions of anthropology. Despite, or precisely because of, being both descriptive and normative, the refined distinctions Raulet intends to use to rephrase the problem of reification in the terms of his theory of recognition leave aside the important aspect of anthropo-sociological thought as we can find it in early French sociology, Gabriel Tarde, and parallel to it in Benjamin's early thoughts. Raulet distinguishes, for example, I quote him, forms of knowledge open to recognition, Anerkennung, sensitive Formen des Erkennens, and forms of knowledge in which every trace of their origin in an antecedent act of recognition has been lost, Anerkennungsvergessenheit in the short German, in the shorter German designation for it. Such distinctions leave out completely the question of mimesis, what is already somewhat surprising given the role they played in Adorno's thought, but this wouldn't be of much consequence were it not for the essay's alleged subject, reification precisely. In Raulet's works, reification and recognition constitute, in the end, two radically opposed modes of the subject-to-object relationship. This is the reason why the possibility suggested by Adorno and Benjamin of a perspective on things that would proceed through things remains entirely unexploited, even under its Adornian form. Sorry, I need some water, but it is so difficult with this microphone. Thank you. Well, in Raulet's words, reification and recognition are two radically opposed modes of the subject-to-object relationship. Whenever Raulet refers to Adorno, he interprets his thought through his own concept of recognition, that is, as a thinker, I quote Raulet, of the oblivion of a former recognition. This could be coherent with Benjamin's philo- and ontogenetic conception, but it remains in Raunet's reflections on the level of a very moderate type of psychoanalysis, interpreting the word former in the sense of secondary processes of the consolidation of personality. And from this follows a reductive conception of praxis, which still depends on that same paradigm of conscience Raulet criticizes in Habermas. Either this practice is conscious of its own conditions of appearance, or it gives in to the instrumental way of acting, that is to say, to a process in which, I quote Raulet, the goal becomes independent of the context in which it originated. End of quote. This either-or appears significantly enough very often in Raulet's text. I could quote quite a lot of other passages. I only will cite one. It is clear that we are dealing here either with institutionalized practices which cause contemplation and observation to become independent of their roots in recognition, or with socially effective thought schemata which compel a denial of antecedent recognition. End of quote. We couldn't find in Ernst Bloch's idea of an objective real possibility a concept close to Benjamin's conception of possibility, a concept which would not reduce dialectics to the paradigm of conscience, but would presuppose a sort of hermeneutics of natural potentialities, as well as of the objective configurations in which these potentialities become reified. The absence of such hermeneutics matches exactly what Raulet describes as a mechanism of denial and defensiveness, Abwehr. Raulet proves he's perfectly conscious of the problem when he admits at this stage of his essay on reification that one issue has indeed been left on the sidelines until now, as he writes, the question of whether we can draw any conclusion from our previous arguments for the primacy of recognition about humans' relation to their natural surroundings and themselves. To which he adds, I quote him, "In the preceding sections, I have drawn on recognitional theoretical considerations to reformulate two aspects of what Lukács termed reification in his classic essay. I have made clear that we can use the term reification in a direct sense only when referring to our relations to other persons, whereas our relation to nature can be called reified only in an indirect or derivative sense of the term, as if it were a metaphor. Raulet does so with a very precise intention, to claim that, I quote him again, that the assertion that the universalization of commodity exchange brought about by capitalism is the sole cause for this phenomenon of reification, and that the subjects are compelled to conduct their social interaction primarily in the form of commodity exchange. End of quote. This idea is, in Raulet's eyes, an outdated idea. It seems very clear to him that in the capitalist world, the persons with whom we interact in the process of economic exchange are, as he writes, normally present to us, at least legally, as recognized persons. Normally. Raulet therefore brings against the myth of the dominating form of an economic exchange of commodity the quite edifying fairy tale of a well-meaning capitalism anxious to peacefully set up fair contracts between equal social partners. Yet his assertions that, quote, the legal status of the participants to an economic exchange protects them from the consequences that would result if each of them took up a merely refined stance toward the other, end of quote, and that the other person has some minimal legal protection under the terms of the contract, which in turn guarantees him a minimal degree of respect, are immediately contradicted by the objective observation that the labor contract tends more and more towards emptiness of meaning. The consequence of that is that the philosophy of recognition uses a pseudo-critique of Lukács not to criticize the assimilation of reification to alienation, as it should, but to claim reification must be put into perspective, or even to deny its very existence. What is at stake finally becomes clear to cast a doubt on the assertion stating that all of society has been capitalized through and through, and on the notion of a totalization of economically based reification. The manipulation Honnett's theory carries out is, in my eyes, self-evident. I will therefore limit myself to point out two warpings in my conclusion. First point, Adorno's K concept, and indeed Benjamin's too, is that of the form of commodity rather than of economic exchange in a general sense, which is only one social praxis among others. Second point, Honneth seems to consider recognition as prior to the economical sphere. He tries to prove that we do not take part in the market only as individuals, but that this taking part implies a reciprocal relationship between individuals who recognize one another as partners in a fair and equal cooperation. The question that follows is, of course, whether this conception that requires freely contracting subjects could be based on an illusion. Does the economic sphere really have immanent norms which allow the market to be a national institution of freedom, as Honneth claims in The Right of Liberty? I would like to leave the question open. Thank you.